She stood beneath the silver lights of New York City, her cropped silver hair catching every flash of every camera. Her earrings dangled like chandeliers, her legs impossibly long in black tights and a striped shirt that became her uniform. She was 22 years old, impossibly beautiful, and burning so bright that everyone who saw her knew she couldn't last. Her name was Edith Sedgwick, and in 1965, she was the most famous face in underground America. But behind the glamour, behind the flashbulbs and the dancing and the endless parties at a place called the Factory, there was a girl who had been broken long before she ever arrived in Manhattan. A girl whose family name carried centuries of American aristocracy, but whose childhood carried wounds so deep they would never fully heal. This is the story of Edie Sedgwick, the poor little rich girl who had everything and nothing, the heiress who became a superstar, and the fragile soul who was consumed by the very fame that was supposed to save her. To understand Edie, we must first understand where she came from. A world of immense privilege wrapped around a core of profound dysfunction. The Sedgwick family was American royalty, their bloodline stretching back to the very founding of the nation. They were descendants of judges, senators, and patriots. Their ancestors had signed the Declaration of Independence and helped shape the laws of a young country. One ancestor, Theodore Sedgwick, had served in the Continental Congress and later became Speaker of the House of Representatives. Another had been a prominent attorney who argued before the Supreme Court. The family name appeared on buildings and streets, in history books and genealogical records. To be a Sedgwick was to carry the weight of American history on your shoulders. By the time Edie was born on April 20th, 1943, in Santa Barbara, California, the family had accumulated not just wealth, but the kind of old money prestige that seemed to exist in a realm separate from ordinary life. This was not the brash wealth of Hollywood, not the new money that built mansions in Beverly Hills and threw parties that made the newspapers. This was something older, quieter, and in its own way, far more suffocating. The Sedgwicks had money so old they no longer thought about it. They had connections so deep they no longer needed to speak of them. They had a way of being in the world that assumed, without ever stating, that they were simply better than everyone else. Her father was Francis Minturn Sedgwick, known as Fuzzy to everyone who knew him. He was a man of enormous contradictions, a bronze sculptor of some talent, a rancher who owned thousands of acres of California land, and a patriarch whose darkness would poison everything he touched. Fuzzy Sedgwick was handsome in the way that wealthy men of his generation were handsome, tall, and athletic, with a strong jaw and eyes that could shift from charming to cold in an instant. He had been educated at the best schools, had traveled the world, had mingled with artists and aristocrats and everyone who mattered. But somewhere beneath that polished exterior, something had gone terribly wrong. Fuzzy came from money so old it had grown invisible to him, like the air he breathed. His family had owned estates throughout New England, had summered at exclusive clubs, had married into other prominent families in alliances that read like corporate mergers. He had inherited not just wealth, but expectations. A sense that the Sedgwick name must be maintained, that appearances must be kept up, that whatever happened inside the family walls must never, ever become public knowledge. The family estate, a ranch called Rancho La Laguna de San Francisco, spread across 3,000 acres in the hills above Santa Barbara. It was a kingdom of horses, cattle, and Spanish-style architecture, where servants attended to every need and the Pacific Ocean glittered in the distance like a promise. The main house was a sprawling hacienda with red tile roofs and cool adobe walls, surrounded by gardens where bougainvillea bloomed in brilliant purple and red. There were stables full of Arabian horses, trails that wound through oak groves and meadows, views that stretched for miles in every direction. To a visitor, it would have seemed like paradise, a golden land where the sun always shone and the living was impossibly easy. But kingdoms, even beautiful ones, can hide terrible secrets. Fuzzy Sedgwick ruled his family with an iron hand wrapped in a velvet glove. He was controlling, manipulative, and prone to dark moods that could shift the atmosphere of the entire household. He demanded absolute obedience from his children and saw any deviation from his wishes as a personal betrayal. His temper, when it flared, was terrifying, and his punishments were designed to break the spirit rather than merely correct behavior. His wife Alice came from the DeForest family, another name that echoed through American history. The DeForests had been prominent in business and society, had built fortunes in railroads and industry, had married into the same exclusive circles as the Sedgwicks. Alice was beautiful and cultured, with a delicate constitution and an artistic sensibility that made her seem almost too refined for the physical world. She played piano with genuine skill, appreciated fine art, and had once harbored dreams of a life devoted to beauty and culture. But she had been broken by her husband years before Edie was even born. The precise nature of that breaking remains somewhat mysterious, shrouded in the family's code of silence about anything unpleasant. What is known is that Alice would spend much of her life in what the family politely called rest, which meant institutions and sanitariums where wealthy people went when their minds could no longer bear the weight of their lives. She drifted in and out of her children's lives, present for some years and then absent for long stretches, a beautiful ghost who seemed to exist in a world slightly removed from everyone else. Edie was the seventh of 8 children, a middle child in a sprawling family that seemed golden from the outside, but was rotting from within. There was Robert Minturn, called Bobby, who would fight his own demons throughout his life. There was Francis, and Jonathan, and Catherine, and Pamela, and Suki, and finally, the youngest, George. Each of these children carried the Sedgwick name like a cross. Each struggled in their own ways with the legacy of their family, and each bore scars that the outside world rarely saw. The Sedgwick children were raised with every material advantage. They had horses and tennis courts and private schools. They summered at exclusive resorts and wintered in elegant homes. They were dressed by the finest clothiers, educated by the best tutors, introduced into society with all the proper rituals and ceremonies. To look at photographs of them from those years is to see the very picture of American privilege. Beautiful children in beautiful clothes posed against beautiful backdrops. But they also had a father whose attention came at a terrible price, whose affection was conditional and whose punishments were cruel in ways that left no visible marks. Fuzzy believed in what he called toughening up his children, which meant a regime of psychological manipulation that would have raised red flags in any modern assessment. He played favorites, lavishing attention on one child while ignoring another, then reversing his allegiances without warning or explanation. He criticized constantly, finding fault with appearance, with behavior, with any sign of weakness or independence. There were darker currents too, suggestions that have surfaced over the years in various accounts of the family. Some biographers have hinted at boundaries that should never have been crossed, at a patriarch whose control over his children extended into areas that propriety forbids naming directly. What is certain is that the Sedgwick children emerged from their gilded childhood, carrying wounds that would mark them for life. The statistics alone tell a grim story. Multiple members of the family would struggle with mental illness, with addiction, with the inability to form healthy relationships. Multiple members would die young, their lives cut short by the accumulated damage of their upbringing. The damage began early for Edie. From childhood, she struggled in ways that her siblings seemed to escape, or perhaps they simply hid their wounds better. She was sensitive, emotional, and desperately eager to please. She wanted nothing more than her father's approval, and she would spend her entire short life chasing it in one form or another. But Fuzzy Sedgwick was not a man who gave approval easily. He demanded perfection and found flaws everywhere. Every achievement was met with a but. Every success with a reminder of how much further she had to go. There was something else, too. Something darker that lived in the Sedgwick bloodline like a shadow. Mental illness ran through the family like a river underground, surfacing in each generation with devastating regularity. Aunts and uncles had spent time in institutions. Cousins had struggled with depression, and worse. The family tree was dotted with early departures and mysterious breakdowns, with lives that burned bright and then simply stopped. It was as if the family's good fortune in worldly matters had been paid for with a curse on their inner lives, as if all that money and prestige had come at a terrible psychological price. Edie's childhood photographs show a girl of startling beauty, with enormous dark eyes that seemed to see too much. Even as a child, she had a quality that cameras loved, a combination of vulnerability and grace that would later make her famous. Her features were delicate but distinctive, her expressions alternating between bright joy and deep melancholy, sometimes within the same frame. Looking at these early images, it's possible to see the woman she would become, the icon who would grace magazine covers and captivate an entire generation. But those photographs don't show what was happening behind closed doors. They don't show the tension that hung in the air like smoke, or the way the children learned to tiptoe around their father's moods. They don't show the visits to her mother in various facilities, the confusion of a little girl who couldn't understand why her mother was sometimes there and sometimes gone, why she had to visit her in strange clinical places that smelled of antiseptic and sadness. They don't show the nights when Fuzzy's temper flared, or the mornings after when everyone pretended nothing had happened. By her teenage years, Edie was already beginning to unravel. She developed an eating disorder that would plague her for the rest of her life, starving herself until her bones showed through her skin, then binging and purging in cycles of self-destruction. The disorder gave her a sense of control in a household where she controlled nothing else. It was also a kind of self-punishment, a way of making herself suffer for crimes she couldn't name, a slow form of erasure, a way of making herself smaller, lighter, less present in a world that seemed to cause her nothing but pain. She became obsessed with thinness in a way that went far beyond the normal concerns of adolescence. She weighed herself constantly, counted every calorie, studied her body in the mirror with an unforgiving eye. When she ate, she was consumed by guilt. When she didn't eat, she felt a grim satisfaction that was the closest thing to happiness she could achieve. The physical damage accumulated slowly, weakening her heart, depleting her bones, creating a fragility that made her beauty seem almost translucent, like a flower pressed between the pages of a book. She was sent to boarding schools, one after another, as her parents tried to find somewhere that could contain her restless spirit. At Catherine Branson School in Ross, California, she was remembered as bright but troubled, a girl who made friends easily but couldn't seem to find peace. She had a way of drawing people to her, a magnetism that teachers and students alike found irresistible. But she also had a way of pushing people away, of sabotaging relationships before they could get too close, of creating the very isolation she feared. She was expelled from St. Timothy's School in Maryland after being caught breaking curfew, The official reason was the violation of rules, but those who knew her understood that the expulsion was really about something deeper, about a girl who couldn't fit into the narrow boxes that institutions tried to put her in. Each dismissal was another failure, another disappointment, another reason for her father to shake his head and wonder what was wrong with her. What was wrong was that she was drowning, and no one knew how to save her. In 1962, at 19 years old, Edie was admitted to Silver Hill Hospital in Connecticut, one of the most prestigious psychiatric facilities in the country. It was a place where wealthy families sent their troubled children, a place of manicured grounds and discreet treatment, where the goal was as much about maintaining appearances as about actual healing. The facility sat on hundreds of acres of Connecticut woodland, with handsome colonial buildings and a staff trained to be as unobtrusive as possible. Edie would spend nearly a year there, diagnosed with what they called an eating disorder and anorexia nervosa, terms that were only beginning to enter the medical vocabulary. The treatment involved talk therapy, medication, and supervised meals designed to help her regain the weight she had lost. It was state-of-the-art care by the standards of the early 1960s, which meant it was well-intentioned, but ultimately inadequate to the complexity of what she was facing. But even in the midst of her breakdown, something remarkable happened. Edie began to find herself, or at least a version of herself, that felt more authentic than the one her family had tried to create. She began to draw and paint with genuine talent, spending hours in the art therapy sessions that were part of her treatment. Her work showed an eye for composition, a sensitivity to light and shadow, a way of seeing the world that hinted at real artistic ability. She started to develop her own sense of style, her own way of being in the world. The illness had cracked her open, and through the cracks, something new was beginning to emerge. When she was finally released, she made a decision that would change everything. She enrolled at the Cambridge School of Weston to complete her high school education, and from there, she planned to attend art school. She wanted to be a sculptor, like her father, but different from him, better than him. She wanted to create things of lasting beauty that would prove she was worth something after all. It was a bid for legitimacy, a way of claiming her own identity separate from the Sedgwick name and all its complicated history. In 1964, Edie moved to Cambridge, Massachusetts, to study sculpture at a small studio. It was here, far from her family's ranch, far from her father's shadow, that she began to reinvent herself. The transformation was dramatic and deliberate. She cut her hair short and dyed it silver, a radical act in an era when women were expected to have long, feminine hair. The silver became her signature, setting her apart from every other beautiful young woman trying to make a mark in the world. She developed her signature look, the dangling earrings that caught the light and seemed to frame her face like punctuation marks, the black leotards and tights that showed off her dancer's body, the heavy eye makeup that made her already enormous eyes look positively luminous. She studied fashion with the same intensity she brought to her art, understanding instinctively that in the world she was entering, appearance was everything. She was becoming someone new, someone who belonged not to the Sedgwick family of old California, but to something entirely different. She was becoming a creature of the night, a butterfly emerging from a cocoon of privilege and pain, and she was about to fly straight into the brightest, most dangerous light in New York City. His name was Andy Warhol. The factory, as it came to be called, occupied the 5th floor of a building at 231 East 47th Street in Manhattan. It wasn't much to look at from the outside, just another industrial space in a city full of them. The building was nondescript, the entrance unmarked, the elevator slow and creaking. But inside, the walls were covered in silver paint and aluminum foil, reflecting the light from bare bulbs that never seemed to go out. The silver was everywhere, on the walls, on the pipes, on every surface that could hold paint. It created an effect that was simultaneously beautiful and disorienting, like being inside a giant mirror or a space capsule from a science fiction film. The space was a studio, a gallery, a nightclub, and a madhouse all at once. It was the court of Andy Warhol, and anyone who entered was playing by his rules, whether they knew it or not. The factory operated on its own schedule, which is to say it never closed. People drifted in and out at all hours, some staying for days at a time, sleeping on couches or not sleeping at all. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and more exotic substances. Music played constantly, conversations overlapped, and through it all, work somehow got done. Paintings produced, films shot, art made. Andy Warhol was already famous by the time Edie arrived in his orbit. His paintings of Campbell's soup cans and Marilyn Monroe had made him the most talked-about artist in America, a man who had somehow transformed commercial imagery into high art. He had started as a commercial illustrator, drawing shoes for advertisements with a skill that made him wealthy but not respected. His breakthrough came when he began to question the very nature of art itself, asking why a soup couldn't be as worthy of attention as a bowl of fruit, why repetition and mass production couldn't be as meaningful as individual genius. But Warhol was more than a painter. He was a filmmaker, a provocateur, a brand, and above all, a collector of people. He surrounded himself with what he called superstars, beautiful and damaged souls who became the subjects of his films and the ornaments of his world. They were drawn from all walks of life, poets and prostitutes, socialites and street people, drug addicts and debutantes. What they had in common was a certain quality that Warhol found irresistible, a combination of beauty, damage, and the willingness to perform their lives for his camera. They met at a party in early 1965 through a mutual friend named Chuck Wine. Warhol saw Edie across a crowded room and was immediately transfixed. She was everything he admired, everything he wanted to capture on film. She was beautiful in a way that seemed almost otherworldly, with those enormous eyes and that silver hair and the way she moved through space as if gravity didn't quite apply to her. She was wealthy in a way that fascinated Warhol, who had grown up poor in Pittsburgh and never stopped being interested in money. She was aristocratic in bearing, but clearly troubled in soul, a combination that Warhol found endlessly compelling. For her part, Edie saw in Warhol something she desperately needed: a new family, a new world, a new identity. The factory promised everything her real family had failed to provide: acceptance without judgment, attention without conditions. A place where being strange and beautiful and broken was not just tolerated, but celebrated. Here were people who understood her, or at least seemed to. Here was a world where her oddness was an asset rather than a liability, where her intensity was matched by everyone around her. Within weeks, she had become Warhol's constant companion. They went everywhere together, to parties and openings, to restaurants and clubs. They arrived arm in arm, perfectly complementary, the pale artist with his silver wig and blank expression, the incandescent girl with her silver hair and dancing eyes. The press noticed immediately. This was a new kind of celebrity, not based on any particular achievement, but on something more ineffable, a quality of being that made people want to look and keep looking. Here was this pale, strange artist with his silver wig and his quiet manner, and beside him this radiant creature who seemed to glow with inner light. They called her an it girl, a term borrowed from the 20s that seemed perfectly suited to her impossible charm. They called her a youth Quaker, part of a new generation that was shaking the foundations of American culture. They called her the Girl of the Year. She was on the cover of Life magazine, photographed by the most famous photographers of the era. She seemed to have arrived fully formed, a star without a movie, a celebrity famous simply for being herself. But what did it mean to be a Warhol superstar? This was a title without substance, a crown made of tinfoil. Warhol didn't pay his superstars. He didn't offer them contracts or help them build careers outside the factory walls. What he did was point a camera at them and let it run, capturing hours and hours of footage that he called films, but that were really something closer to surveillance. He watched them perform their lives, and he turned that watching into art. For Edie, this attention was intoxicating. After a lifetime of feeling invisible in her own family, of being told she was never quite good enough, here was someone who wanted to look at her constantly. Warhol's camera loved her. His films gave her a kind of immortality, freezing her beauty and her youth in silvery black and white. In movies with names like Poor Little Rich Girl and Beauty Number 2 and Kitchen, she played versions of herself, rich girls adrift in a world that didn't understand them, beautiful women surrounded by people who wanted things from them. The films were strange, avant-garde works that challenged every convention of commercial cinema. There were no scripts. Dialogue was improvised or simply captured as it happened. Scenes ran for far longer than audiences were used to, forcing viewers to sit with discomfort, with boredom, with the raw truth of watching another human being exist. In one famous sequence, Edie simply lay in bed, talking on the phone, smoking cigarettes, being herself. It lasted for hours. It was mesmerizing. Edie had never acted before, but she didn't need to act. She simply had to be, and being was what she did better than anyone. The camera caught something in her that was impossible to fake, a quality of presence that made it impossible to look away. She filled the frame with her personality, her gestures, her expressions that flickered between joy and despair. She was magnetic in a way that transcended technique. The months that followed were a whirlwind of glamour and chaos. Edie moved into an apartment in the Chelsea Hotel, that legendary building on 23rd Street, where artists and musicians and writers lived in various states of creative ferment. The Chelsea was a world unto itself, a vertical village where eccentricity was the norm and conventional behavior was viewed with suspicion. Her rooms became an extension of the factory, full of visitors at all hours, full of noise and smoke, and the endless social whirl that seemed to have become her entire existence. She was spending money at an alarming rate, burning through her trust fund on clothes and parties and whatever substances promised to keep her going through nights that never seemed to end. The trust fund her grandmother had left her had seemed inexhaustible at first, but nothing is inexhaustible when you're spending without thought of tomorrow. Designer dresses, expensive restaurants, tips that amounted to the average person's weekly salary, all of it adding up week after week until the numbers began to tell a worrying story. She had started to use amphetamines to stay thin and alert, pills that doctors prescribed freely in those days without understanding the damage they could do. The drugs were called diet pills, a cheerful euphemism for powerful stimulants that kept users awake for days at a time and wreaked havoc on the body and mind. The drugs made her sparkle even brighter, but they were also burning her from the inside out. Her already fragile constitution was being stressed beyond its limits, her heart weakened, her nervous system frayed. Meanwhile, her relationship with Warhol remained ambiguous, fascinating, and ultimately destructive. They were never lovers in the conventional sense. Warhol's sexuality was famously complicated. existing in some space between gay and asexual that defied easy categorization. Whatever he felt for Edie existed in a realm beyond simple categories. But there was an intimacy between them that was undeniable. A kind of artistic marriage that bound them together even as it prevented either from fully committing to anything else. The problem was that Warhol collected people the way other people collect art. He gathered them, displayed them, and eventually moved on to the next acquisition. His affection was real but shallow, a spotlight that could shift without warning. He was constitutionally incapable of providing the unconditional love and support that Edie desperately needed, yet he was very good at making it seem like he might provide those things. He drew people close enough to depend on him, then kept them at a distance that left them always wanting more. Edie, who had spent her whole life seeking unconditional love, had attached herself to someone constitutionally incapable of providing it. She mistook attention for affection, proximity for intimacy, being looked at for being loved. The factory gave her a stage, but a stage is not a home. The superstars were her friends, but friendships forged in drugs and late nights tend to evaporate in the morning light. She was surrounded by people, but fundamentally alone. The cracks began to show. 1966 arrived, and with it came warning signs that even Edie's most devoted admirers couldn't ignore. She was thinner than ever, her body wasting away beneath her signature costumes. The bones in her face had become sharper, more prominent, giving her an almost skeletal beauty that was as disturbing as it was striking. The spark in her eyes was becoming something harder, more desperate. There was a febrile quality to her energy now, a sense that she was running on fumes. She was using more drugs, sleeping less, and finding it increasingly difficult to function in any world outside the factory's silver walls. The amphetamines that had once helped her shine were now necessary just to get through the day. She had moved beyond diet pills to harder substances, chasing highs that grew harder and harder to reach. Her trust fund was nearly depleted, and the practical concerns of life, paying rent, buying food, planning for the future, seemed impossible to address. And then something happened that would accelerate her downfall. Another star entered Warhol's orbit, a German singer and model named Nico. She was blonde, beautiful, and possessed of an icy European glamour that made her the perfect muse for a new phase of Warhol's work. Nico had been a model in Paris, had appeared in a Fellini film, had connections to the international art scene that even Edie couldn't match. Her voice was deep and strange, her manner remote and mysterious. She was everything that Edie was not. Suddenly, Edie was no longer the only beautiful, damaged woman in the factory. She was no longer the automatic center of attention. Warhol's camera, that eye that had seemed to belong to her alone, was now turning elsewhere. The magazines that had once clamored for Edie were now interested in this new face. The hierarchy of the factory, already unstable, had shifted beneath her feet. For someone whose entire identity had become wrapped up in being seen, this displacement was catastrophic. Edie began to pull away from Warhol, or perhaps he pushed her away. The accounts differ, as they always do when relationships end badly. What is certain is that by the middle of 1966, the golden partnership that had made them both famous was effectively over. She had given him everything: her beauty, her time, her image, her story, and he had given her, what exactly? Fame that was already fading, films that she didn't own and couldn't profit from, connections to a world that suddenly seemed less interested in connecting with her. She tried to reinvent herself again. There were rumors of a screen test for a Bob Dylan project, though nothing came of it. Dylan himself had been interested in her, had seen in her something kindred, another damaged soul burning bright. But the project fell apart, victim to the same chaos that seemed to surround everything Edie touched. She attempted to launch a legitimate acting career, meeting with managers and producers who saw her fame, but couldn't figure out how to package it. She was too strange for Hollywood, too damaged for the mainstream, too famous to start over as an unknown. The months that followed were a descent that seemed to have no bottom. Edie bounced between New York and California, between fleeting relationships and dead-end projects. She was hospitalized repeatedly, for overdoses, for breakdowns, for the accumulated damage of years of self-destruction. Each time she would emerge briefly, would seem to rally, would talk about new projects and fresh starts, and each time she would fall again, deeper than before. Her family, the Sedgwicks of old California, watched from a distance. They sent checks and hired doctors and hoped that somehow their difficult daughter would find her way. But they were part of the problem, not the solution. The same family dynamics that had wounded her in childhood continued to wound her in adulthood. Her father's disapproval, her mother's absence, the family's habit of covering up unpleasant truths, all of it conspired to keep her from getting the help she needed. But there was no finding her way. Not really. The bright light that had drawn everyone to her was flickering now, guttering like a candle in a draft. The face that had launched 1,000 magazine covers was gaunt and haunted. The style that had defined an era now looked like a costume she was too tired to take off. She was only 23, 24, 25, but she had lived so hard and so fast that she seemed ancient. In 1967, her brothers Minty and Bobby both died within weeks of each other. Bobby, who had struggled with similar demons, his own eating disorders and addictions, and the same family wounds that had marked all the Sedgwick children, took his own path out of this world. He was found in his apartment in New York, having chosen not to continue. The family barely had time to absorb this loss when Minty's death followed, a motorcycle accident that may or may not have been accidental. 2 brothers, gone in a matter of weeks, another chapter in the family's dark history. For Edie, already hanging by a thread, these losses were almost too much to bear. She had been close to Bobby, had seen in him a mirror of her own struggles. His death was a warning she couldn't ignore, a glimpse of where her own path might lead. But it was also a weight she wasn't strong enough to carry. She collapsed into grief, into drugs, into the hospital again. She returned to California, to the ranch she had fled years before, and began what would be the final chapter of her short life. The prodigal daughter come home, though not in triumph. She was broken now, in ways that everyone could see. The silver hair had grown out, revealing brown roots that made her look oddly vulnerable, like a disguise slowly slipping away. The famous wardrobe had been replaced by simpler clothes, the kind of things you wear when you've given up on making an impression. There were more hospitals, more treatments, more attempts to break free from the addictions that had become her constant companions. The medical establishment of the late 1960s was learning, slowly, how to treat addiction. But it was still primitive compared to what would come later. The treatments were harsh, the success rates low, the understanding of the underlying psychology limited. Edie went through the motions, attending meetings, talking to doctors, taking the pills they prescribed to help her get off the other pills. She met a fellow patient named Michael Post, and in a moment of hope that feels heartbreaking in retrospect, they married in 1971. Michael was young, earnest, and believed he could save her. He saw past the damage to the person underneath, or at least he thought he did. Their wedding was simple, nothing like the elaborate society affairs her family had once envisioned for her. They exchanged vows in a hospital chapel, two wounded people promising to help each other heal. For a few months, it seemed like maybe, just maybe, Edie had found her way to something like peace. She was living quietly in Santa Barbara, far from the silver lights of the factory. She was trying to stay clean, trying to imagine a future that didn't involve constant crisis. She was talking about going back to art, about the sculpture she had once dreamed of making. She was talking about having children someday, about building a life that was nothing like the one she had left behind. She was 28 years old, impossibly young, and yet she had already lived several lifetimes worth of drama and pain. Her body bore the marks of everything she had been through: the eating disorders, the drugs, the hospitalizations, the accumulated wear of burning too bright for too long. But she was alive, and she was trying, and for those who loved her, that was enough. On November 15th, 1971, she attended a fashion show in Santa Barbara with her husband. It was a normal event, the kind of thing that happens in wealthy resort towns, local society gathering to see the season's new styles. Edie was there as a guest, no longer the center of attention, but simply another face in the crowd. She seemed happy, witnesses said later, more at peace than she had been in years. She chatted with acquaintances, smiled for photographs, showed no signs that anything was wrong. That night, she went to sleep in her husband's arms. They had been married for 4 months. She never woke up. The official cause was listed as probable acute barbiturate intoxication, the coroner's careful language for what happened when the accumulated damage finally caught up with her. She was 28 years and 10 months old. The news of her passing sent ripples through the art world, through the fashion industry, through everyone who had ever been dazzled by her particular kind of light. It was not entirely a surprise to those who knew her story, but it was still a shock. She had seemed in those final months to be getting better. She had seemed to have found something worth living for. But her body had been through too much, had carried too many burdens, and in the end, it simply gave out. Tributes poured in from people who had known her and people who had only admired her from afar. They spoke of her beauty, her spirit, her unique way of being in the world. They spoke of what she had represented, the promise and the peril of the 1960s, the way a generation had burned so bright and so fast. They spoke of wasted potential and tragic endings and all the clichés that surround young deaths. Andy Warhol, when asked about her, gave one of his characteristically elliptical answers, a few words that revealed nothing and everything about the complicated relationship they had shared. He called her wonderful, which she was. He moved on to the next question, the next interview, the next project. The factory continued, the art continued, life continued, as it does. But what, in the end, was Edie Sedgwick's legacy? What did her brief, brilliant, tragic life actually mean? In one sense, she was a victim, a product of her time and her circumstances, a fragile soul crushed by forces far larger than herself. She was born into a family that gave her everything except the one thing she needed most, which was unconditional love and acceptance. She was exploited by an art world that valued her image more than her humanity, that used her up and moved on to the next beautiful disaster. She was failed by a medical establishment that didn't understand mental illness or addiction or eating disorders or any of the complex interrelated conditions that plagued her. She was a casualty of the 1960s, that decade of upheaval and experimentation that destroyed as many people as it liberated. But Edie was also something more than a victim. She was an artist in her own right, even if her medium was herself. She created a style, a look, a way of being that influenced fashion for decades to come. The androgynous glamour, the cropped silver hair, the heavy dramatic eyes, the combination of aristocratic breeding and street-level cool, all of this was Edie's invention, and all of it entered the cultural bloodstream permanently. Designers still reference her look. Models still try to capture her essence. The image she created continues to resonate, an aesthetic blueprint that has never gone out of style. She was also, in her way, a revolutionary. She refused to play by the rules that her class and gender were supposed to follow. She rejected the path that was laid out for her, the debutante balls and society marriages and quiet life of a proper Sedgwick woman. Instead, she blazed her own trail, even if that trail led to destruction. She chose art over propriety, freedom over security, authenticity over pretense. These were radical choices in her time, and they carry weight even now. Perhaps most importantly, Edie Sedgwick represented something true about the human condition. She showed us that beauty and pain can coexist in the same person, that privilege cannot protect you from suffering, that the brightest lights often cast the darkest shadows. Her story is a tragedy, yes, but it is also a kind of mirror, reflecting back at us our own capacity for wonder and destruction. We recognize something of ourselves in her, the part that wants to burn bright regardless of the cost, the part that longs to be seen and known and loved. The factory is long gone now, replaced by anonymous office space that bears no trace of its silver-covered past. The Chelsea Hotel still stands, though it has been renovated into something far more respectable than the bohemian Warren of Edie's time. The art world has moved on to new stars and new scandals, and the 1960s have become history, studied in universities and commemorated in museums. The avant-garde has become the mainstream. The revolution has been televised and merchandised and reduced to nostalgia. But Edie Sedgwick endures. Her face appears in fashion magazines as an icon of a certain kind of style. Her story has been told in books and films and documentaries, each one trying to capture what made her so compelling. Young people who weren't born until decades after her passing discover her and feel a connection that transcends time. There is something eternal about her, something that speaks to each new generation that finds her. Maybe that's because her story is, in some fundamental way, universal. It's the story of a person seeking love and finding fame instead. It's the story of a talent that never quite found its proper outlet. It's the story of a life lived too fast and too bright, a flame that consumed itself before it had a chance to become something steadier and more sustainable. We all know someone like Edie, or fear we might become someone like Edie, or secretly admire the courage it takes to burn that bright, even knowing the cost. When you look at photographs of Edie Sedgwick now, half a century after her light went out, you can still feel the pull. Those enormous eyes seem to look directly at you, asking questions that have no easy answers. Why do some people burn so bright? Why do we destroy the things we love? What does it mean to be seen, truly seen, in a world that is always looking for the next beautiful face? The questions hang in the air, unanswered, perhaps unanswerable. The Sedgwick family ranch is still there in the hills above Santa Barbara, though it has long since passed out of the family's hands. The old house where Edie spent her troubled childhood still stands, its Spanish tiles and graceful archways unchanged by the decades. If you drive up the winding road to where it sits overlooking the Pacific, you can almost imagine a little girl looking out at the endless water, dreaming of escape, dreaming of becoming someone other than who she was born to be. She got her wish, in a way. She became Edie Sedgwick, the name that still resonates in fashion and art and popular culture. She became the girl of the year, the poor little rich girl, the superstar who needed no movie to make her famous. She became a legend, which is both more and less than being a person. Legends don't suffer, don't struggle, don't lie awake at night wondering if anyone truly loves them. Legends are fixed in time, perfect and untouchable. Real people are messier, more complicated, more heartbreaking, and maybe that's the final lesson of her story. Fame is not the same as love. Being seen is not the same as being known. The spotlight that seems so warm from the audience's perspective is actually cold when you're the one standing in it, alone despite the millions of eyes upon you. Edie learned this lesson the hard way, learned it with her body and her mind, and finally with her life. Edie Sedgwick lived fast and left a beautiful corpse, as the old saying goes. But she was more than her beauty, more than her tragedy, more than the sum of all the magazine covers and film reels and gossip column inches. She was a human being who wanted what all human beings want, to be loved, to be understood, to matter. She wanted to be seen not as an image or an icon, but as herself, whoever that turned out to be. In the end, she found some of that in the final months of her life, in her marriage to Michael Post, in the quiet California days away from the chaos that had defined her for so long. She found peace, or something close to it, before the darkness finally caught up with her. The tragedy is that she found it so late, with so little time left to enjoy it. The grace is that she found it at all, and perhaps that's the kindest way to remember her. Not as the tragic figure, not as the victim, not as the cautionary tale, but as a woman who fought hard against impossible odds and who, in the end, found a moment of grace before she went. She deserves to be remembered whole, not just as a warning about the dangers of fame or the cruelty of the 60s or the dysfunction of wealthy families. She deserves to be remembered as Edie, the girl who loved to dance, who loved beautiful things, who had so much talent and so much pain, and who did the best she could with both. The silver lights of the factory have long since gone dark, but somewhere, in the collective memory of a culture that loved her and destroyed her and loves her still, Edie Sedgwick keeps dancing. Her earrings catch the light. Her eyes shine with something that might be joy or might be pain or might be both at once. And she remains, as she always was, impossibly beautiful, impossibly sad, impossibly herself. That is the story of Edie Sedgwick, the heiress, the superstar, the poor little rich girl who had everything except the one thing she needed most. She was a daughter of American aristocracy who became the face of underground art. She was a troubled soul who burned too bright and too fast. She was a cautionary tale and an inspiration, a victim and a revolutionary, a legend who remains as compelling today as she was when she first stepped into Andy Warhol's silver world. Some stories don't have happy endings. Some flames are too beautiful not to burn out. But even extinguished flames leave light behind, rippling outward through time and space, touching people who never knew the source, but who feel the warmth anyway. That is what it means to leave a legacy. Not monuments or museums, but the quiet influence that continues long after you're gone. Edie Sedgwick's flame was like that. It burned for 28 years, and in that brief time, it illuminated something true about what it means to be human, to be beautiful, to be broken, and to be remembered. She showed us ourselves, our hungers and our weaknesses, our dreams of transformation and our fear of being forgotten. She held up a mirror made of silver and reflected back our deepest longings. The cameras have stopped rolling. The parties have ended. The factory is nothing but a memory preserved in books and films and the fading recollections of those who were there. But Edie endures, in the photographs that still capture something indefinable about her essence, in the fashion choices that still echo her style decades later, in the art she inspired and the stories we tell about her, in the questions she still asks us about fame and love and what it means to be truly seen. She wanted to be seen. She was seen, and we are still looking. That is her legacy. That is her tragedy. That is her triumph. The girl with the silver hair and the dancing earrings. The heiress who became a superstar. The flame that burned too bright. Edie Sedgwick. Remember her name.